Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. Let's take a minute to talk about lines. Not so much the kind Rick James was obsessed with. I mean, after all, cocaine is a hell of a drug, but more like the kind our good friend Joe, aka Joseph Nasty Daddy Lieberman, was obsessed with. The kind of lines that once you get into trying to control could be even more addicting than the Rick James kind. Although, in all fairness to old Joe, I guess I'm not really one to talk. I mean, I started this whole podcast dedicated to, quote, the art that crosses the line, end quote. So it may lead you to ask, well, Ronnie, where do you cross the line? Okay, fine, then I'll do it. Well, Ronnie, where do you cross the line? Well, friends, who are apparently too good to echo back my question, my answer's pretty plain. I draw the line at real-world actual violence. The best chance a book has of killing someone is to use a copy of Infinite Jest to beat someone to death with. But Infinite Jest, or any other equally robust volume of literature, isn't our topic this week. Quite the contrary, actually. This week, we will be talking about the relatively skinny, but surprisingly wordy Anarchist Cookbook, first published in 1971 by one William Powell. It should be noted that this William Powell should not be mistaken for the early 1900s film actor William Powell, who, fun fact, I know nothing else about. Our William Powell was born on December 6, 1949, and came to age during the 60s. Or, as he would say of those late teenage years in New York, quote, I was in the process of forming opinions, end quote. Now, we've talked about the 60s before on a few episodes of the podcast, so without diving too deep into it, we know there is a rose-tinted memory of the 60s that was fed to us by hippies that grew up to be TV executives. A world where peace, drugs, and free love of the youth culture banded together to bring the dinosaurs of hate and bigotry to their rightful extinction. I don't want to sell the era short by being glib or cynical. For sure, the hippie movement and the decade they so embodied did achieve a number of great things. But as we learned back on our episode on Fritz the Cat, it wasn't all flower children and rainbows. In fact, it could be downright fucking ugly. And that, my friends, is where our William Powell enters the story. He spent much of his childhood in Britain, as his dad was a press agent for the United Nations. In Britain, he was made fun of and ostracized as he was a fish out of water of sorts, being the only American in his class. He would later be kicked out of his fancy boarding school for, quote, gently pushing a teacher's car into a ravine would be an exaggeration, end quote. At the age of 11, Powell and his family moved back to the States, New York to be specific. Back home in America, he would be made fun of yet again for being a fish out of water, as he was mocked for having an English accent, even by his 5th grade teacher. And before things get too ugly, this is a good time to do this week's trigger warnings. We will be talking about child abuse, both physical and sexual, acts of terrorism, and police brutality. As much as he got picked on, our young William was no angel himself. One night, he and some other boys sexually humiliated one of their peers at his boarding school by holding him down and applying Bengay to his genitals. The young boy in question would go on to tell the headmaster about what had happened, but for some reason, soloed out only young William. When he was called to answer for his misdeeds, William Powell was put into a jockstrap and molested by the headmaster. At the ripe young age of 17, an angry and alienated William Powell moved out on his own to the mean streets of New York City. It was here he proceeded to do what so many angry and alienated young men do in a big, unforgiving world. He isolated himself even further. He watched the world unravel from the headlines and the TV news. By his own account, he felt that he was living in the apocalypse. America was in the middle of an increasingly ugly Vietnam War, and support back home was wavering, to say the least. America was also going through the atrocities like Kent State Massacre, where the Ohio National Guard opened fire on anti-war protesters, killing 4 students and injuring 9 others. Malcolm X had been assassinated. This brought about the creation of the Black Panther Party that was then personally put on the shit list of the FBI by none other than J. Edgar Hoover himself, the first director of the FBI. But there was one moment in particular that stood out to William Powell, and that was the Grand Central Station Yippin'. The Yippin', as it was called, is not only a fun word to say, but also a very poorly thought out and planned peaceful demonstration by the YIP, Y-I-P, or Youth International Party, or just Yippies if you're nasty. New York City doesn't have a reputation for being the most spacious place on the planet. So when the Yippies showed up for their Yippin' at Grand Central Station, it raised the occupancy to an estimated 6,000 people. The police, both uniformed and plain-clothed, came out in droves. They watched as the Yippies engaged in such reprehensible behavior as chanting and bouncing balloons through the crowd. As time went on, though, a few managed to climb on top of the information booth, where they made silly poses. After that, one of the clocks in the station had its arms bent and moved around. But the final straw was when someone or someones set off 2 cherry bombs whose blast reverberated in the small space. And with that, the police moved in on the crowd. And of course, by moved in on the crowd, I mean there was a police riot. Fun fact, that's twice I quoted myself in one episode. What preceded was not only a violent clash against the Yippies, with cops beating them with billy clubs, arresting those who threw up their hands in self-defense for resisting arrest, and beating unconscious those who did not defend themselves. But the police also turned on the press. Don McNeil of the Village Voice was there to cover the event, with his press credentials pinned to his jacket. He was grabbed and pushed into a glass door by 2 police officers, managing to crack both the glass and McNeil's face. They then threw him on the street and left him there, on the floor, with blood covering his face and press credentials. He would go on to require 5 stitches for the incident. Abby Hoffman, one of the founders of the Yippies, also author of the book Fuck the System, which was itself an inspiration for Powell's Anarchist Cookbook, had this to say about the era. Quote, "America has decided to devour its youth. We will resist. We will not participate in America's Children for Breakfast program. Fuck 'em." End quote. Should be noted that Abby Hoffman is the same Abby Hoffman that was a member of the infamous Chicago 7, who were charged by the United States federal government with conspiracy and crossing state lines with intent to incite a riot, all in relation to the anti-Vietnam War protest they headed in Chicago, Illinois during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Fun fact, the Chicago 7 was originally the Chicago 8. The 8th member was Bobby Seale. Not only was he the only black member, but he was also the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. Seale refused to stay quiet in the courtroom. It should be noted that his connection to the protests were flimsy at best. After repeated outbursts, Judge Julius Hoffman, no relation, would have Seale bound and gagged in the courtroom. And when even that wouldn't silence him, he was sentenced to 4 years in jail on 16 counts of contempt and was severed from the case. When looking back on the era, William Powell would simply say, quote, "I thought the government was out of control." End quote. So William Powell armed himself with the 2 only weapons he needed, a typewriter and a library card to the New York Public Library. It was there that he dove into the U.S. combat shelf, where he found a large supply of decommissioned government manuals. Add to that things like Boy Scout guidebooks and electronics catalogs, and Powell would spend from 1968 to 1970 researching his book, taking notes at the library by hand, and then taking them home and compiling them and typing them up. His original plan was to make flyers of these recipes, like making homemade LSD or how to properly throw a Molotov cocktail, and hand them out around New York. But eventually, the project turned into a full-blown cookbook. Though this is not to be mistaken. This was not only a collection of these so-called recipes, which spanned a wide array of everything illegal, but also featured long diatribes throughout about the author's experience with the recipes and his anarchy political views. The end result was half manifesto, half instructional manual. In a certain sense, this put him years ahead of the curve of having to read half a goddamn autobiography before you get to the ingredients of any internet recipe. The book itself contains a foreword, an introduction, and 4 chapters. Now, each chapter has several different recipes, but let's just take a look at the subjects for the moment. Chapter 1, drugs. Chapter 2, electronics, sabotage, and surveillance. Chapter 3, natural, lethal, and non-lethal weapons. And really, the chapter that sealed the book's infamous status, Chapter 4, explosives and booby traps. The topics covered in these chapters included things like how to grow pot, how to use banana pills as a psychedelic, broadcasting free radio, cattle prods, how to make tear gas in your basement, all the way to how to make things like TNT and something called a nipple time bomb, the last of which can appropriately be found in the booby traps chapter. He compiled his manuscript along with several sketchy hand-drawn illustrations and began to look for a publisher. Powell stated, quote, "The central idea to the book was that violence is an acceptable means to bring about political change," end quote. He sent the book off to over 30 publishers. Finally, the book, along with its copyright, which is very important, were sold to Lyle Stewart of Lyle Stewart Inc. Lyle Stewart was a bit of a character himself. He'd started off as a reporter, and later he was a business director for the infamous EC Comics, EC being the publisher of Tales from the Crypt and many other horror and crime comics that would bring them under the ire of the Comics Code Authority. Fun fact, EC Comics would later change their artistic direction and become Mad Magazine. When Lyle Stewart started his own publishing company, the aforementioned creatively titled Lyle Stewart Inc., he quickly gained a reputation for publishing controversial books. One of the more notable, besides the Anarchist Cookbook, being The Sensuous Woman by Terry Garrity, or rather by her pseudonym, J. Should be noted that Lyle Stewart was a firm believer in the First Amendment and would continue to push the boundaries in publishing in his next endeavor, Barricade Books, where he would republish a novel by the name of The Turner Diaries, which has been described as, quote, explicitly racist and anti-Semitic, end quote, by the New York Times, and has been labeled the, quote, Bible of the racist right, end quote, by the Southern Poverty Law Center. To top it all off, it is also thought to be one of the books that inspired Timothy McVeigh in committing his 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. It should be noted that Lyle Stewart very emphatically disagreed with the content of the Turner Diaries, which he would put explicitly in the introduction of his re-release of the book. Whether or not that absolves him of any association with that book, I mean, that's up to you. Also, fun fact, Lyle Stewart was co-owner of the Aladdin Hotel in beautiful Las Vegas, Nevada. Lyle Stewart had a less than stellar reputation in many parts. In fact, William Powell would note that when on tour for the book, someone set off a smoke bomb in the building while they were doing a press conference. Stewart claimed that it must have been a group of anarchists that were less than pleased about the release of the book, which, by the way, there were many that did not like this book. But Powell noticed that when the bomb went off, the only 2 people who didn't flinch was Stewart and his secretary, leaving him to believe that the publicity stunt was orchestrated by Stewart himself. Soon after the book's release, the death threats started coming against William Powell. Having had studied to be a writer, he was well aware of the irony that would be the author of the Anarchist Cookbook going to the police for protection, So he bought a gun and continued to live out a quiet life pursuing his other endeavors. Meanwhile, the Anarchist Cookbook was released on the world. Quote, read this book, but keep in mind that the topics written about here are illegal and constitute a threat. Also, more importantly, almost all the recipes are dangerous, especially to the individual who plays around with them without knowing what he is doing. Use care, caution, and common sense. This book is not for children or morons. End quote. That was the last paragraph of the introduction to the Anarchist Cookbook. The following is a non-comprehensive list of notable events tied to the Anarchist Cookbook since its release in 1971. 1976. Police linked the bombing of Grand Central Terminal and hijacking of a TWA flight to Croatian radicals who employed directions from the Anarchist Cookbook. 1981. The Anarchist Cookbook was linked to Puerto Rican rebels who bombed an FBI headquarters using the book's directions. Thomas Spinks also employed the text that year during the bombing of 10 abortion clinics in the United States. 1995. The perpetrators of the Oklahoma City bombing were alleged to have used directions from this book, making it the second Lyle Stewart publication tied to the bombing. 1999. Police found the Anarchist Cookbook in possession of the Columbine High School shooting perpetrators, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, in Littleton, Colorado. 2007, a 17-year-old was arrested in the United Kingdom and faced charges under anti-terrorism law in the UK for possession of this book, among other things. He was cleared of all charges. In October 2010, in County Durham, UK, Ian Davidson and his son were in prison under anti-terrorism laws for the manufacturing of ricin. Their possession of the Anarchist Cookbook, along with its availability, was noted by the authorities. In 2012, the Anarchist Cookbook was found to have been in the possession of the perpetrator of the Aurora Theatre shooting. In 2015, the London public transport bombers were linked to having used this book. In 2016, the book was refused classification by the Office of Film and Literature Classification upon release, thus making the book banned in Australia. In 2017, a 27-year-old prosecuted in the UK solely for possession of the book. He was ultimately found not guilty. In 2020, a 23-year-old mathematics graduate of the University of Cambridge was convicted of collecting information useful to a person committing or performing an act of terrorism based on his possession of the book, despite claiming to have bought the book from Amazon out of academic interest. Back in 2015, a documentary film crew headed by director Charlie Siskel tracked William Powell down and interviewed him over the course of a week in his home in France with his wife, Oshan Kusuma Powell. Fun fact, Charlie Siskel is the nephew of legendary film critic Gene Siskel. The film was called American Anarchist, link in the show notes. And the William Powell we see in it is not the one that many might expect. Gone are the days of his youth where he bore a striking resemblance to a younger, more handsome Che Guevara. Now, into his mid-60s, he's put on some weight, hangs around in his quiet, desolate cottage in khakis, blue button-up shirts, and a sweater vest. He looks more like an old professor than a revolutionary anarchist. And because, quite frankly, that's what he is. The film is worth watching, even if Mr. Siskel sometimes gets a little pushy with the narrative as he interviews Powell. The film explores Powell's current relationship with and feelings about the book, some 40-some-odd years out from its release. Sadly, Powell would never get to see it as he passed away from a heart attack on July 11th, 2016, just a few months before the movie's premiere. Now, why was the William Powell of American Anarchist so different from that of the Anarchist Cookbook? Well, to start off with, he regretted writing the book almost immediately. Soon after his press tour, he stopped discussing the book, even with his friends, and he got rid of all the copies in his apartment. He took a job on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline as the chief timekeeper. He would go on to become an English instructor in a home for disturbed boys. In 1975, he moved back in with his parents in Westchester, volunteering as a special ed teacher, earning a master's degree in English, and eventually landing a paid teaching job upstate. He met his wife, O'Shawn, and the two of them traveled the world teaching. He focused on children with learning disabilities and other special needs. His days of authoring hadn't stopped, but now he had become the co-author of several educational books and books about education. His wife and him founded the professional development organization Education Across Frontiers. Over the years since, he's tried to get the book out of circulation, but back in 1970, when he sold the rights to the book, he also sold the copyright as well, leaving his hands somewhat tied. The only logical steps he could think of was to write an author's note on Amazon, where he publicly denounced the book, and also wrote a piece for The Guardian doing the same, explaining that his feelings were not those of what he wrote in the Anarchist Cookbook anymore. When questioned in the American Anarchist documentary, Powell said that he had knowledge that his book was linked to Columbine and maybe one or two others, but he had no idea of the long laundry list of incidents the book had been attached to. He said he felt remorse for having written the book and for what people had used the book to do. But he also acknowledged that even though they used his book and he felt responsible, it wasn't him who did it. While Powell may not have been necessarily haunted by his involvement with the book, it seems, to me at least, that he really never knew what to do with that information and the feelings that came along with it, which I guess is a haunting in its own way. None of this is a defense of William Powell or the Anarchist Cookbook. I guess it's technically not a defense either. It's just to say I don't know. Does it matter that Powell never even tried most of the recipes and that a good deal of them just plain out don't work at all? If you remember correctly, they set homemade bombs at Columbine, but they failed to go off. It was guns that did all the real carnage. I don't know. Remember the psychedelic banana thing? That actually turned out to be a hoax that he reprinted because he never tried it. Does it come into play that he collected this information from the library where anyone could have looked it up? Or that even if you couldn't have just looked it up, it was all known to a very hostile government, or even worse, the Boy Scouts? I don't know. How much should we care that as James J.F. Forrest, a professor of security studies at the University of Massachusetts, said, quote, "It was inevitable that he did it. If he hadn't done it, somebody else would have. It's human behavior to tap into a dangerous stream of knowledge." End quote. I don't know. How about the fact that regardless of whether or not the facts in this book were documented, that doesn't make them any less true? Does that play into it? I don't know. Am I part of the problem? Did me buying this book contribute to it still being easily accessible? I'm not living out some Tyler Durden fantasy here. I bought the book off of Amazon and had it shipped to my house Prime. As a fact, I made an episode about it, spreading the allure of this mysterious book. Even if I'm not taking part of its past, am I taking part of the horrible events that will be linked to this book's future? I mean, I don't think so. I don't know. One thing I do know is if some poor, misguided soul were to listen to this podcast and somehow, some way, it inspired them to commit some heinous act, it would tear me up. I don't know how I could live with that. And no matter how much I knew I did nothing wrong, I would carry that around for the rest of my life. So please, dear listeners, my friends, I'm trusting you. I'm trusting you to not get a copy of this book and go kill people. Or how about we just not kill people in general? I'll tell you what, if you're feeling really freaky, we could even go so far as to avoid physical violence. The more observant of you will notice that a constant feature of the show notes of this podcast is information for the National Sexual Assault Hotline, RAINN, RAINN. Well, starting from this episode going forward, I will also have the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration also available in the show notes. If you ever feel like harming yourself or others, they can point you towards the help you need. I'll end on this. The final chapter of the Anarchist Cookbook has this to say, quote, "This chapter is going to kill and maim more people than the rest put together, because people just refuse to take things seriously. The formulas and recipes in here are real. They can be made by almost anyone, and they can be performed in the kitchen. The people in the house on 11th Street, killed in New York in 1970 in an explosion caused by bombs they were making, did not know what they are doing. Not only did they kill themselves, but also some innocent people. Ignorance thus not only becomes fatal and inexcusable, but also criminal. If you are not absolutely sure of what you are doing, do not do it. The revolution has too many goddamn martyrs as it is." End quote. You know what? Maybe we all have too many goddamn martyrs as it is, and innocent victims to boot. Well, before I go, one final fun fact, friends. I'll miss you. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach. And please like, comment, subscribe. And if you donate blood, come join our Band Media Podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.